The morning sun barely kissed the horizon, casting a pale gold glow across the barren land. The wind howled through the valley, sharp and cold, carrying with it the scent of dust and something more, something unmistakable. Elias Ward pulled the reins tighter, his silver-gray eyes squinting into the haze of dawn. His weathered horse, Red, snorted and stamped his hooves impatiently as they crested the hill, and Elias, with a heart heavy from years of war, saw the place that would now be his. The cabin sat there, abandoned and cold, just as his uncle had left it. The land stretched endlessly beyond it, the promise of a fresh start. It was supposed to be a new beginning, a place to finally lay down the weight of his past and take hold of something that could be his. But what he found as he rode up to the gate was not what he had hoped for. Not even close. There, hanging from rough ropes, 5 women swayed in the morning breeze, their lifeless bodies silhouetted against the gray sky. They were nothing more than broken silhouettes, tattered dresses fluttering like flags of defeat. Their faces, hidden beneath wild hair, were unrecognizable, but the cold, cruel truth was clear. They had been left there as a warning. A reminder that this land, and all it contained, belonged to someone else. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The message was unmistakable: this ain't your land. What belongs to Morrison will always belong to Morrison. The name sent a chill down his spine. Morrison. Elias had heard whispers about him, whispers of a man who controlled this land with a fist made of iron and blood. A man who would do anything to hold on to his power. But seeing these women, strung up like cattle to dry, made it real. Made it personal. Elias's hand tightened around the reins, his throat dry as sand. His eyes flitted from one body to the next. The faces blurred by the wind, but there was a flicker, a pulse, weak but there, on the woman nearest him. He took a deep breath, his gut twisting as he swung himself down from Red. His boots hit the frozen ground with a dull thud, and his hand went to the cold steel of his revolver, though he knew it wouldn't be necessary. Not yet. With slow, deliberate steps, he approached the first woman. She was small, her body pale and limp, yet her chest rose faintly, barely perceptible in the cruel wind. He moved fast, his hand steady despite the fear creeping in his veins. He took his knife and sliced through the rope, and her body fell forward into his arms with a soft thud. Her neck was raw, marked by the tightness of the noose, but she was alive. Alive. He didn't stop. The others, hanging like broken dolls, had to be cut down. Each woman's body was bruised, scarred, but beneath the dirt, beneath the pain, Elias saw a spark. A fight, flickering in their eyes. He cut each rope quickly, catching them as they fell, dragging them to the safety of the cabin. Each woman he rescued was another step into a war he didn't yet understand. But Elias Ward wasn't a man to turn his back on someone in need, no matter the cost. The land, the inheritance, none of it mattered anymore. The moment he cut those ropes, he was no longer a man just looking for peace. He was a man who had made a choice. And that choice meant the storm he had feared for so long had come. Inside the cabin, the flickering light from the hearth cast shadows on the women's faces, revealing their exhaustion, their anger, and their resolve. One by one, they sat up, pain still etched in their features. The black-haired woman's gaze met Elias's, her lips cracked but strong. "You're walking straight into a storm, landowner," she said, her voice hoarse, yet filled with fire. Elias looked down at the rope burns on their necks, his fists tightening. The storm had already arrived, and whether he liked it or not, there was no turning back now. The war had begun. The fire crackled in the hearth, its orange glow casting long shadows across the cabin's weathered walls. Elias sat by the fire, his eyes darting from one woman to the next, his mind heavy with the weight of what he had just stepped into. The wind howled outside, but inside, the warmth from the flames did little to ease the chill running through him. He had cut the ropes, saved the women. But what now? Elias knew that cutting those ropes wasn't just an act of mercy. It was a declaration. He had just picked a side. The land wasn't just his anymore, not after what he had done. It belonged to the women now, too. The choice he had made had bound him to them in ways that ran deeper than just law or land. He had stepped into a fight that would cost him more than he could afford to lose. The black-haired woman, the first to wake, looked at him with hard eyes, as though she were trying to read him, searching for something deep in his soul. She spoke first, her voice rough, but fierce. "You know what you've done, don't you? You're a man who has no choice now. You've cut us down, which means you've chosen your side. Morrison won't let this go." Her lips twisted in something that could have been a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Elias met her gaze, steady and unflinching. He wasn't afraid of her words. He knew the danger. Hell, he'd seen enough bloodshed in his days to know what kind of man Morrison was. The name sent a ripple of tension through his chest, the same way a storm cloud gathers force before the rain hits. He wasn't a fool. He'd heard the rumors. Morrison was no small threat. The women slowly gathered themselves, their bruised bodies stiff from hanging in the wind, but their spirits weren't broken, not yet. Each one of them had a fire in her eyes, a sense of defiance that Elias knew was going to be as much of a blessing as a curse. But he wasn't about to turn them away. They had come this far, and now they were in this together. Ruby, the red-haired woman, was next to speak, her voice sharp and full of anger. "If you know what's good for you, you'll saddle up and ride off. You don't need to be part of this. You don't know what you're getting into." She leaned forward, her hands clenched into fists as if the very idea of continuing this fight made her itch with rage. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even look away. He simply nodded and said, "I didn't come here for peace. I came here to settle what was owed." His voice was low, but it held a weight to it, a certainty that hung in the air like the heat of the desert sun. The room fell into a heavy silence. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the older woman, Grace, stood up. She was the quiet one, but her presence was strong, and there was something about her calm that made Elias respect her even more. "You don't know what kind of man Morrison is," she said softly, but her voice carried. "He's not just a judge. He owns the law here. He owns the people. You cut us down because you think you're doing right, but he won't stop until he's got us all, dead or alive." Her words hit home, but Elias didn't flinch. He wasn't a man to back down once he'd made a decision. The fire flickered in his eyes, and he spoke again, his words like steel. "I didn't come here to be some farmhand. I came here to stand. If I don't do it now, I'll never be able to live with myself. You want to fight? I'll stand beside you." Clarabelle, the black-haired woman, nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You're not a fool," she said, her tone softer now. "You know what you're up against, and that's why we're going to make sure you don't die alone." Her words were the last he needed to hear. Elias stood, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had made his choice. This wasn't just about land. It wasn't even about survival. This was about something deeper, something primal. It was about honor. And in the West, honor was as precious as gold. And just as deadly. The fire crackled as Elias reached for his rifle, the wood groaning in protest under his calloused hands. He looked out at the valley, the fog creeping across the ground, as if the land itself was waiting for the storm to break. His silver-gray eyes narrowed, and with one last glance at the women, he spoke again, his voice low, but unwavering. "We stand together. If we fall together. But I won't turn back." Outside, the wind howled louder, and Elias knew the war was coming. And when it came, he would be ready. The fire had burned down to a dull glow by the time all 5 women were awake. They sat huddled by the hearth, their faces pale but their eyes hard, full of something that wasn't quite fear. It was something sharper. Something that had been born of suffering and had only grown stronger in the quiet aftermath of survival. The air was thick with tension, the sound of the wind outside whispering like a distant threat. Elias stood by the door, his back to the wooden frame, arms crossed. He could feel their eyes on him. Each one of them had been through hell and back, and yet, there was something more. They weren't just victims of a cruel world, they were survivors. Fighters. The black-haired woman, the one who had spoken first, leaned forward, her breath still shallow but her voice as sharp as a whip. "Morrison didn't just hang us for fun," she said, her words cutting through the air. "We were chosen. We're a message, Elias. You don't hang 5 women unless you're sending a warning." Elias didn't speak right away. He let her words settle in the air. He had known this wasn't a random act of violence. The brutality, the message carved into the wood, the man behind this was powerful, ruthless. But hearing it out loud made the truth more real. Clarabelle, the woman with the quiet strength, nodded in agreement. "Morrison runs this land with his iron fist. He's not just some judge in a black robe. He's a trafficker. A man who uses people like cattle to build his empire." Her words were like stones thrown into the calm waters of Elias's mind, each one sinking deeper into the truth of what he was facing. Ruby, the fiery redhead, scowled as she pressed a hand to her side, where the rope had burned into her skin. "He's got connections. The sheriff, the local law, they're all in his pocket. He gets away with everything, because he makes the rules." Her voice was bitter, full of anger and something else, something deep and personal. Elias stepped forward, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. He could see the fury in her eyes, the same fury that had been in his when he was forced to fight for a cause greater than himself. "Then it's not just a matter of survival," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is a fight for justice." Sadie, the blonde woman, looked up from the floor where she had been resting, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was soft, almost delicate, but her eyes told a different story. "We've got something," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Proof. Proof that Morrison's crimes run deeper than just forced labor. He's got documents, contracts, fake deeds, everything you need to bring him down." Elias's heart quickened. "What kind of proof?" he asked, his gaze narrowing. Violet, the quietest one of the group, reached into the worn leather pouch at her side and pulled out a handful of papers. She unfolded them carefully, placing them on the floor in front of Elias. The documents were old, the ink faded, but the seals were unmistakable. The markings of a man who had bought his way through the law, who had used power to forge a future built on the misery of others. "This," Violet said, her voice steady and cold, "is the proof that Morrison isn't just a judge. He's a criminal. A thief. And he's been using this land, our land, to line his pockets." Elias picked up the papers, his fingers brushing over the ink. It was all there, the names of corrupt officials, forged signatures, deeds that had never been signed in truth. He could feel the weight of it, the lives tied to each page, each lie. And he knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't just about revenge. This was about righting a wrong that had been festering for far too long. "We're not just fighting for our lives anymore," Clarabelle said, her voice low and determined. "We're fighting for everyone Morrison has crushed under his boot. And we're not stopping until he pays for what he's done." The weight of her words settled over Elias like a heavy coat, but there was something else too, a fire, burning in the eyes of each woman in the room. They had been through hell, but they were still standing, still fighting. Elias stood up, feeling the heavy weight of the decision he had made. There was no turning back now. The storm was coming, and he had already chosen his side. "We'll take this fight to him," Elias said, his voice rough with determination. "But we'll do it on our terms. This ends now. Together." The women nodded in unison, a silent agreement passing between them. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a fight for justice, and they were ready to see it through. Outside, the wind howled louder, a reminder of the storm that was coming. But inside the cabin, amidst the flickering shadows, Elias felt a calm resolve settle within him. There was no turning back now. The morning came slow, just like the storm Elias had been expecting. A thick fog hung low over the valley, draping the land in a blanket of uneasy silence. The wind had died down, but the air felt charged, like the calm before a shootout at high noon. Inside the cabin, the fire was just a flicker of orange and red, casting long shadows on the walls. The women were quiet, each one deep in thought, eyes fixed on the map Elias had spread out before them. Ruby, always the one to speak her mind, broke the silence first. "Morrison won't just sit back and let us walk away. He'll come for us, and when he does, he won't come alone. He's got the sheriff, the whole town behind him. Hell, he probably owns half of M." Elias nodded, his hand brushing the weathered surface of the table. "I know. That's why we have to move first. We can't wait for him to get the drop on us. If he wants a fight, he's gonna get one." Clarabelle, sitting by the fire, adjusted her worn-out shawl and looked up, her sharp green eyes meeting Elias's. "You think we're ready for that kind of war? The man controls everything, every man in this town. You cut us down, Elias, and you've signed up for something bigger than you think." Elias's gaze never wavered. He had known what he was walking into when he made that choice, and no matter how deep the storm, he wasn't about to back down. "I didn't come here for peace, Clarabelle. I came here to take back what belongs to us. This land isn't Morrison's to own, and I'll be damned if I let him use it to bleed people dry." The room fell quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was different. It was thick, heavy with the weight of what they were about to face. Outside, the fog was starting to lift, revealing the wide expanse of land beyond the cabin, and Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Sadie, sitting near the window, peered out into the mist. Her brow furrowed as she scanned the horizon. "He's coming," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "I can feel it." Elias stood up, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. "How do you know?" "I don't know," Sadie replied, her voice tight. "But I've lived in this country long enough to know when trouble's close. Morrison won't waste time. We're already on his radar." As if on cue, the distant sound of hooves reached their ears. At first, it was a quiet thrum, barely noticeable, but it grew louder by the second, a heavy, rhythmic pounding of horses' hooves against the hard-packed dirt. Clarabelle stood, her eyes narrowing as she walked toward the door. "It's him. I can feel it too. This is it." Elias stepped forward, his hand instinctively going to the rifle resting by the wall. The sound of the horses grew closer, and soon, they could see the figures approaching through the mist. 3 riders. The sight of them made Elias's gut tighten. These weren't just any riders, they were men who had sworn loyalty to Morrison, men who were used to taking what they wanted without hesitation. Ruby, her eyes flashing with fire, grabbed a pistol from the table. "I don't care if it's 3 or 30, she said, her voice low and full of rage. "I'm not gonna let him take us without a fight." Elias motioned for the women to stay low. "We wait until they're close. We don't show ourselves too early. If they come looking for a fight, we'll give them one they won't forget." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Outside, the riders drew nearer, their figures becoming clearer in the fog. The sound of their horses' hooves echoed like a countdown, the inevitable clash of wills just moments away. As the riders reached the clearing, Elias could see their faces more clearly now. They were rough men, weathered by the sun and the life they had chosen. They didn't come to talk. They came for answers. But what they didn't know was that Elias and the women weren't just survivors. They were fighters. And they weren't going to be cowed by Morrison or anyone else. Elias's heart beat in time with the hooves as the riders stopped 100 yards from the cabin. They were close enough now. He could see the glint of rifles and the steely resolve in their eyes. The first move was always the hardest. But Elias had never been one to hesitate. He turned to the women, his voice low and steady. "Get ready." The tension broke as one of the riders lifted his hand, signaling for the others to stop. The leader, tall, dark-haired, and cold-eyed, dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. He looked toward the cabin with an air of arrogance, like a man who knew he could take whatever he wanted. Elias stepped outside, rifle in hand, his boots crunching on the gravel as he met the man's gaze. "You're trespassing," Elias said, his voice carrying through the air like a shot from a rifle. The man's lips curled into a sneer. "Morrison wants those women back, Ward. And I'm here to make sure you understand that." Elias didn't flinch. "Morrison doesn't get to take anything from me, or from these women. Not now, not ever." The man's smile faded, replaced by cold fury. "Then we'll see just how long that confidence lasts, won't we?" The sound of gunfire cracked the air, and just like that, the war had begun. The fog had lifted, but the weight of the morning still hung thick in the air, like a heavy quilt that wouldn't let go. Elias stood at the edge of the porch, his rifle resting in his hands, his mind sharp as a tack. He could feel the heat of the coming confrontation like a storm brewing in the distance. The riders from Morrison's camp had moved off, but Elias knew they'd be back. They always came back. His eyes scanned the horizon as he stood tall against the biting wind. The sound of the horses' hooves echoed in his mind, but now, it was the silence that gnawed at him. Something was off. A presence lingered just beyond the cabin, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Inside, the women were preparing, each of them checking their weapons, getting ready for the fight they knew was inevitable. Ruby, the fiery one, was pacing near the window, her hands jittery but her eyes steady. Sadie was sitting by the fire, her fingers lightly tracing the barrel of a sawed-off shotgun. Clarabelle, as calm as ever, was cleaning her revolver with slow, deliberate movements, her face a mask of focus. Violet and Grace were making sure their ammunition was ready. "They'll be back," Ruby said, voice tight with anticipation. "It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when." Elias turned from the porch and stepped into the cabin. "When they come, we'll be ready. But we wait for the right moment. Don't make the first move." His voice was steady, his mind already anticipating the clash to come. He'd faced enough gunfights in his life to know that timing was everything. If they rushed into this, they'd be walking into a trap. Elias had seen men with less training than the riders outside get gunned down before they even had a chance to aim. This time, they would control the pace. Ruby gritted her teeth, clearly itching for a fight. "I've got no interest in waiting. Every minute we sit here is one more minute Morrison's men have to plan." Elias met her gaze, his expression hard as steel. "Patience, Ruby. We wait, and when they come, we show them what happens when they mess with the wrong people." The sound of horses' hooves thundered in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. It was too soon, Elias knew, but there was no turning back now. The storm was here. He motioned for the women to take their positions. They didn't need words. Each of them moved like they had been born to this kind of fight. The riders appeared at the edge of the clearing, 3 men on horseback. Their faces were grim, like wolves moving in for the kill. Their leader, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face, spurred his horse forward, his eyes cold as death. "Ward," he shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You cut those women down, and now you've sealed your fate. Morrison's not gonna let this go. You're a dead man walking." Elias stepped forward, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. His eyes locked with the man's, cold and unwavering. "If Morrison wants to send more of his dogs to do his dirty work, he's welcome to try. But you're gonna have to go through me first." The man sneered, but it was clear from the way his eyes flicked to the rest of the women that he wasn't sure what he had walked into. They were ready for a fight, and they weren't about to back down. The leader spurred his horse forward again, his gun drawn in one smooth motion. "You really think you're gonna stop Morrison?" He owns this land. He owns everything here. You're just some man with a rifle, hiding behind a cabin. Elias didn't flinch. And you're just a man with a gun. Come and get it. His voice was like gravel, rough and unyielding. The gunfire came fast and loud, echoing across the valley. The leader fired first, a shot that went wide, grazing the side of the cabin. Elias didn't hesitate. He fired back, the bullet striking the man's horse in the shoulder. The animal reared, throwing its rider off, and the man hit the ground with a thud. The other two riders rushed forward, guns drawn, but Ruby and Sadie were ready. Ruby fired first, dropping one man in his tracks. Sadie followed, blasting the other rider off his horse with a thunderous boom from her shotgun. For a moment, the world stood still. The three riders lay motionless in the dust, their horses grazing nearby, untouched by the violence that had just unfolded. Elias stood still, rifle raised, scanning the field for any more riders. But the silence stretched on. They were done for now. But the battle was far from over. Ruby walked up to Elias, her chest heaving with adrenaline. "That was too easy," she said, a grin pulling at the corners of her mouth. "They'll be back, won't they?" Elias nodded grimly. "They'll be back. And next time, we'll be ready." The fight was just beginning. Morrison's men weren't going to stop until they had everything. But Elias wasn't going to let them have it. Not without a hell of a fight. As the fog began to settle back in over the valley, Elias knew one thing for sure: the West had a way of testing a man. And the road ahead was gonna be a rough one. But he wasn't about to turn back. Not now. Not ever. The night was quiet, but it was a heavy silence, the kind that made a man feel like trouble was just waiting around the corner. Elias stood outside the cabin, his back to the firelight, staring into the dark distance. The wind had died down, and the only sounds were the occasional crackle from the hearth and the soft shuffle of the women inside, cleaning their weapons, gathering their strength. It was the calm before the storm, but this time, Elias didn't feel like there was any escaping it. The storm was already here. Inside the cabin, the women sat in a tight circle, the fire flickering between them. Clarabelle's voice broke the silence, her tone quiet but hard. "Morrison isn't just a man with a bit of power," she said, her eyes never leaving the flames. "He's a god around here. The law bends to him, and anyone who gets in his way disappears." Ruby, still fresh with the anger of their first skirmish, nodded. "I've heard the stories. Hell, everyone has. But hearing it from you, she cut herself off, her fingers tightening around her revolver. "It's hard to believe anyone can hold that much control. The law's supposed to protect people, not serve them." Clarabelle glanced over at Elias, her eyes sharp as a hawk. "That's what makes him dangerous, Ruby. He's not just a man who rules with fear. He's a man who's learned how to get away with anything. He's forged papers, bribed officials, and made sure anyone who stood against him vanished without a trace." Elias stepped inside, his boots silent on the floorboards. He could feel the weight of her words in his chest. He had heard the whispers, but hearing it spoken aloud, so plainly, made it all the more real. Morrison wasn't just some tyrant sitting in a fancy chair. He was a man who had wrapped the law around his little finger, a man who had turned an entire town into his personal kingdom. Violet spoke then, her voice soft but laced with a quiet fury. "He's been at this for years. The sheriff, the judge, half the town's leaders, they're all in his pocket. Anyone who tried to stand up to him either disappeared or had their name slandered so badly that they couldn't show their face in public again." Elias's jaw tightened. "So, he's got the whole town wrapped up tight, huh?" Grace, who had been silent until now, nodded. "More than you know. He buys up land, forges documents, and forces families to sign over everything they own. If they refuse, they end up like us." She paused, her eyes hardening. "He targets the women, because he knows they're easier to control. but we don't play by his rules anymore." Elias could feel the fire of their determination burning hotter in the room, and something inside him stirred. He had never been one to back down from a fight, and this wasn't a fight he was going to lose. "So, what now?" Elias asked, his voice low but filled with resolve. "We take him down," Clarabelle answered without hesitation, her eyes meeting his. "We've got the proof. Those documents Violet carried, they're his undoing. If we can get them to the right people, the right authorities, we can expose him for what he is." Her gaze hardened. "But first, we need to survive long enough to get it done." Ruby stood up, her fingers wrapping around the grip of her revolver. "You want to fight fire with fire, Elias? Then you've got me. I'm in this to the end." Her eyes flicked to the door, where the distant howls of coyotes echoed on the wind. "And I ain't afraid of dying. Not anymore." Sadie nodded, her face set in a grim line. "Morrison's a bully. He preys on the weak and the desperate. But he's never met anyone like us. We may not be the law, but we're sure as hell gonna make sure he feels the weight of it." Elias looked around the room, his gaze lingering on each woman's face. There was no doubt in his mind now. They were in this together, bound by something deeper than just survival. They had a cause, and it was one that couldn't be ignored. "All right then," Elias said, his voice firm. "We take the fight to him. We find a way to get that evidence to the right people, and we make sure he knows he can't just take what he wants anymore. We fight like hell, and we make sure he regrets ever thinking he could play God around here." The room was quiet for a moment, but the tension between them was no longer the uneasy kind, it was a solid, unbreakable force. Morrison had taken his first shot, but Elias knew now that it was time to hit back. The fire burned brighter in the hearth, and outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the promise of something more. Something that would change everything. And Elias was ready. The war had begun, and this time, he wasn't going to lose. The days passed with a quiet tension that hung in the air like a storm ready to break. The fog had lifted, but the heavy weight of uncertainty still pressed down on the valley. Elias had seen enough in his life to know that when trouble came, it came fast and hard. And sure as hell, it was coming for them. Inside the cabin, the women were making ready. It was a rhythm now, a routine. They checked their weapons, prepared their ammunition, and spoke in hushed voices as they gathered around the old wooden table. Each woman, in her own way, had made peace with what was to come. They had no illusions. They knew the fight ahead would not be an easy one. But they had no choice. The world Morrison had built wasn't just a kingdom, it was a prison. And they weren't going to let him keep them shackled any longer. Elias stood at the window, his eyes scanning the horizon. The valley stretched wide before him, the land untouched and beautiful, but marked now by the shadow of what was coming. He could almost feel the riders as they neared, a quiet hum in the earth, the pressure building. Morrison's men were out there, no doubt about it, and they were on the hunt. "You hear that?" Ruby's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned, meeting her gaze as she stepped toward him, a rifle slung across her back, a determined set to her jaw. "What do you mean?" "That sound. Hoofbeats." "Not just one or two," she said, her eyes narrowing. "There's a whole damn pack of them coming this way. Morrison sending the dogs." Elias didn't need to ask any more questions. He could feel it too, the air thick with anticipation, the horses' hooves pounding like a drumbeat in the distance. The time had come. The final showdown was at hand. He moved swiftly, his boots clicking on the floor as he walked toward the women. Grace was already standing, her old musket in hand, a solemn look on her face. "They're coming for us, Elias. We've waited long enough. We can't wait any longer." He nodded, his gaze hard. "I know. It's time. We stand our ground. When they come, we give them everything we've got." Clarabelle, who had been quiet up until now, spoke in a low voice, her eyes sharp. "We've got the proof. The documents Violet carried, they're our leverage. But we can't let them get away. Not this time." Elias glanced over at Violet, who nodded in silent agreement. "We fight to the end," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. The sound of the horses grew louder, closer. Elias could almost hear the men's laughter in the distance, the cocky arrogance of men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. He clenched his fists. He'd seen enough of that kind of man in his day. They were used to getting their way, used to making people bend to their will. But they hadn't met him, or these women. And they weren't going to bend. Not today. Elias took a deep breath, his fingers running over the familiar grip of his rifle. He could feel the weight of the situation settle in his chest, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He'd made his choice, and there was no turning back. "They think they're coming to claim what's theirs," Elias said, his voice low, but steady. "But they've forgotten one thing. This land ain't theirs. Not anymore." Ruby smirked, a gleam of fire in her eyes. "Damn right. Let's make sure they remember that." Elias turned toward the door. He opened it slowly, the creak of the old wood sounding louder than it should have. The wind had picked up again, howling like a wolf in the distance. It was a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was the call of danger, the warning that the fight was here. Outside, the fog had started to settle in again, swirling around the cabin, adding to the atmosphere of tension. The riders were close now. He could see the silhouettes of their horses, their figures coming out of the mist, like ghosts from a past that wouldn't let go. There were more of them this time, at least a dozen riders, all armed and looking for blood. The leader, the same man from before, was in the front, his eyes hard as stone. He didn't say a word, just spurred his horse forward, his gun resting in his hand. Elias stood firm, his rifle raised, his voice steady. "This land belongs to the people who fight for it," he called out. "And I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever." The leader sneered, his voice cold as he called back. "You're a fool, Ward. You think you can stop Morrison? You're outnumbered. Outgunned." Elias didn't flinch. He steadied his aim, ready for whatever came next. "We'll see about that." With a signal, the riders charged. The air seemed to snap, the sound of hooves pounding the earth like a war drum, and the final battle began. In that moment, Elias knew that whatever happened next, it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A chapter that would be written in blood, in defiance, and in the name of justice. As the first shot rang out, the west roared back to life. The dust was thick in the air as the riders charged, their horses kicking up clouds that swallowed the land. The howls of the wind mixed with the sound of hooves pounding against the dry earth, creating a rhythm that matched the pounding in Elias's chest. His heart didn't race, he had long learned that fear had no place in a man who was prepared to die, but the adrenaline was sharp and raw, a familiar taste in his mouth. This wasn't just another fight. It was the one that would decide everything. He stood tall, rifle steady in his hands, as Morrison's men closed the gap. They were coming fast, too fast, but he didn't move. Not yet. Not until the moment was right. Inside the cabin, the women were ready. He didn't need to look to know. Each one of them was armed, their eyes hard and focused, ready to give everything they had to protect this land, their land. Clarabelle was by the door, her revolver ready, her gaze unwavering. Ruby stood near the window, her hands clutching her rifle with the kind of determination that made Elias proud. Sadie, ever the quiet one, checked the rounds in her shotgun, the weight of her focus heavy in the air. Grace and Violet were both near the table, setting up to cover any angle that might give them an advantage. Elias gave them one last look, his gaze meeting theirs. Without a word, they all understood. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. It was about taking back what Morrison had stolen. The riders were almost upon them now. They were spread out, circling the cabin like vultures, looking for a weakness, trying to figure out where the best place to strike was. But Elias knew better. He had learned the land, and he knew that this was their moment. The high ground around the cabin offered them the advantage. The riders were exposed, and as long as they held their position, they would have the upper hand. The leader, the same man with the scar running down his face, spurred his horse forward. He was tall, grim, and carried himself with a cocky swagger, like he had already won. "You made a mistake, Ward," he shouted, his voice carrying across the valley. "You thought you could just take what's Morrison's. You'll die for it." Elias stepped forward, his rifle aimed at the leader's chest. He didn't flinch. "If Morrison wants it, he'll have to come get it," Elias called back, his voice steady, full of cold defiance. "But not today." Without warning, the leader raised his gun, firing a shot that whipped past Elias's ear, sending a plume of dust up into the air. The shot rang out like a thunderclap, and in that moment, all hell broke loose. Elias fired first, his bullet finding its mark in one of the riders just behind the leader. The man's horse bucked, throwing him to the ground with a sickening thud. In an instant, the gunfire started, a chaotic symphony of death as Morrison's men opened fire on the cabin. Bullets whizzed by, ricocheted off wood, and struck the ground, sending dust and splinters flying. But the women didn't flinch. Ruby was the first to return fire, her rifle kicking up dirt as she dropped one of the riders from his horse. Clarabelle was close behind, her revolver roaring as she took down another. The cabin came alive with gunfire, each shot landing with deadly precision. Sadie and Violet moved together, flanking the door and firing in quick succession. Grace's old musket boomed, sending a rider tumbling from his saddle. Elias kept his focus, his rifle never wavering, taking down 2 more men as they tried to rush the cabin. He could hear the leader shouting orders, but it didn't matter. The advantage was theirs. The riders had underestimated them, thinking that they were just a bunch of helpless women and 1 man. But what they hadn't counted on was the fire in Elias's eyes or the fierce will of the women who fought alongside him. The leader spurred his horse toward the cabin, his eyes blazing with rage. "You think you've won? This isn't over, Ward." Elias fired one last shot, knocking the man off his horse and sending him sprawling into the dirt. The remaining riders hesitated, realizing that their leader had fallen. The dust was thick now, and the smoke of the gunfire mixed with the fading echoes of the battle. Elias stood, his chest rising and falling with the weight of it all. They had done it. They had held their ground. But as the smoke cleared, Elias knew this wasn't the end. This battle, this victory, was just a moment in a larger war. Morrison's men would regroup, and the fight would continue. But they had won today. They had stood their ground, and they had made it clear that this land, this place, wasn't Morrison's to take. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't a quiet of defeat, it was a quiet of triumph. Elias turned to face the women, their faces smeared with sweat and dirt, but their eyes alive with the fire of victory. They had fought together, and they had won. Elias didn't smile. He didn't need to. There was still work to be done, but for the first time since he had set foot on this land, he felt like they had a chance. A real chance to take it back. And that was a fight he would see through, no matter the cost. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the valley bathed in a soft, fading light. Elias sat on the porch of the cabin, his rifle resting across his knees. The air was still, but the remnants of battle hung thick in the atmosphere. The wind was gentle now, almost apologetic, as if it had carried all the violence with it and left a fragile peace in its wake. Inside, the women were tending to their wounds, their eyes focused, but their spirits were as unbroken as ever. They had survived today, but Elias knew better than to think the worst was over. They had made their stand, but Morrison wouldn't rest until he had what he wanted, until he had them all. Clarabelle came out to join him, her green eyes sharp and calculating. She had that look again, the one that made Elias think she had seen more than her fair share of this world's darkness. But there was something else in her eyes now, something different. It was a flicker of hope, or maybe just a glimmer of something worth fighting for. "You did good today," she said, her voice steady but low. "We all did. But don't think this means he's gone. Morrison won't stop until we're all dead or he's got the land back under his thumb." Elias didn't look at her. He couldn't. He was watching the smoke from the fire drift into the sky, feeling the weight of everything he'd promised. "I know," he said, his voice gravelly. "But we've got something now. We've got proof. The papers. The documents. We've got the truth." He let that hang in the air. The truth. He'd seen it in those worn pieces of paper that Violet had handed to him earlier. What they had, what Morrison thought he could bury, was more than just a piece of evidence. It was the key to taking him down. Clarabelle didn't answer immediately. She just sat down beside him, the weight of their fight hanging in the silence. The fire crackled, sending embers into the night air. Finally, she spoke, her words carrying the gravity of everything they'd been through. "Morrison's not just some crook who can be run out of town. He's a man who's bought off the law, Elias. He's got the sheriff, half the town's officials, hell, even the judge. If we just send that to the marshal, they'll burn it. Morrison's too powerful to be taken down that way. He'll find a way to make it disappear, just like he's done with every other soul he's crushed under his boot." Elias's fist clenched around the rifle, his knuckles going white. He knew she was right. That kind of man didn't just go away when the truth came out. They fought dirty, used every card in the deck, and played by a different set of rules. But there was something else, something he hadn't seen clearly until now. The women, these women, had given him more than just hope. They had given him purpose. They had shown him that standing tall wasn't about winning a fight. It was about making sure the fight was worth it. And they weren't backing down. "We'll take the fight to him," Elias said, his voice filled with conviction. "But we'll do it the right way. We'll show him the truth, make sure everyone knows. We won't let him hide behind his badge and his money." Clarabelle's eyes met his, her gaze steady and unflinching. "We don't just need the truth, Elias. We need something bigger. Something that makes him fear us. Fear what we've got. We have the land, and we've got the evidence. But we need the marshal, the real law. If we don't go to the right people, Morrison will walk free." Elias stood, his boots firm against the ground. The firelight reflected in his eyes, hard and determined. "We'll go to the marshal. We'll make sure this truth reaches the right ears. But we won't stop there. We'll make sure Morrison's power is broken, and we'll see to it that no one else has to live under his rule." It was the first time since he had stepped foot on this land that Elias truly believed they could win. But winning wasn't just about taking back the land. It was about taking back their lives, lives that Morrison had stolen from them one piece at a time. And with that, Elias made a promise, one that wasn't just about surviving. It was about justice. It was about fighting back, no matter how big the fight or how strong the enemy. And this time, it wasn't just his fight. It was theirs, too. The night had settled into a quiet peace, but Elias knew that the storm was far from over. And when it came again, they would be ready. But this time, they wouldn't just be fighting for survival, they would be fighting for something much greater. The morning was still, a quiet kind of peace that sat heavy in the air, like the calm before a thunderstorm. The land had been painted with the soft, golden light of dawn, the kind that only came after a long night of struggle. The battle was over, but Elias knew better than to think the war had ended. Not yet. He stood outside the cabin, looking out at the wide, open expanse before him. His rifle rested across his knees, his hand still steady from the fight they had just survived. But there was no satisfaction in the victory, not yet. Morrison might have lost today, but Elias knew he wasn't a man to quit that easily. Inside, the women were packing up their belongings, preparing for the final step of their journey. The evidence was ready, the truth about Morrison's deeds ready to be laid bare. Elias had made up his mind. They would go to the marshal, hand over the proof, and let the law take its course. But deep down, he knew there would be consequences. There always were when a man stood up against the system. Ruby stepped outside, her boots kicking up dust as she walked over to Elias. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her eyes, something that said, "We've come this far, we'll see this through to the end." She stood beside him for a moment, both of them staring out across the valley. "You really think the law's gonna do something about it?" Ruby asked, her voice low but steady. Elias took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he thought it over. "I don't know, Ruby. But it's the only shot we've got. If we don't take it, we're letting him win. And I'll be damned if I let Morrison think he can get away with this." Clarabelle came out next, her quiet strength ever present. "We've got one shot at this," she said, her voice calm but filled with certainty. "Once we get to town, there's no turning back. It's either justice, or it's the end of the line." Elias nodded, knowing that she was right. This wasn't just about them anymore, it was about the whole damn town. The people Morrison had crushed, the families he had ruined. If they didn't act now, if they didn't take a stand, then they were no better than the men who had let Morrison reign unchecked. The horses were ready, packed with what little they had left, and the women were set. The documents that would expose Morrison's empire of lies and deceit were safely stashed away. Elias turned and looked at them all one last time, the women who had stood by him, who had fought alongside him when the odds seemed impossible. "We ride for the marshal's office today," Elias said, his voice steady, though there was a weight in his chest that he couldn't quite shake. "If we can't bring him down by law, then we'll do what we have to. But we do it right." Sadie stepped forward, her face a mix of determination and the quiet knowledge that they were walking into a storm. "You said this wasn't just about land. It's about something bigger, something worth fighting for. I'm with you, Elias. Let's finish this." The women all nodded in unison, their faces grim, but resolute. The time had come. They were ready to face whatever lay ahead. The ride to town was long, the horses moving at a steady pace, the weight of the journey pressing down on them. The valley slowly gave way to the dusty road leading into town. As they neared the marshal's office, Elias could feel his heart in his throat. This was it, the moment of reckoning. They were about to lay it all on the line. As they rode into town, the eyes of the townsfolk followed them, whispers rising in the streets. They had all heard the stories of Morrison's grip on the town, of the way he had ruled with fear. Now, those stories were about to be brought to the light. The marshal stood on the steps of his office, his expression unreadable as Elias approached. He had heard about the fight, heard about the bloodshed, and yet here Elias stood, walking into the lion's den with the truth in his hands. "You've got one chance," the marshal said, his voice low and gruff, but there was a flicker of something, maybe respect, maybe fear, behind his eyes. "This isn't gonna be easy, Ward. You know that." "I'm not here for easy," Elias replied, his voice hard. "I'm here to do what's right." And with that, they handed over the evidence, the documents that would expose Morrison's empire of lies. The marshal took them without a word, his gaze flickering between the papers and Elias. Then, slowly, he nodded. "It's not over yet," the marshal said quietly, looking up at Elias. "But this is a start." As Elias turned to leave, he knew the fight wasn't over. Morrison would fight back, of that he was certain. But for the first time in a long while, Elias felt something he hadn't in years, hope. They had started something. And in the West, where the land was harsh and justice often came slow, that was something worth fighting for.